All right, let's do it then. Welcome, everyone, for a very special episode of the Group Up podcast. We are here for what I'm calling the Great Dev Interview. No debates today. We figured it would be a bit more peaceful today. And it's going to be very exciting because, as many of you know, there's been a blog recently dropped by game director Alan Keller talking about 6v6 and the hot button issue and talking about the history of Overwatch. And we thought, well, who better to talk about that than the man himself? So we've got some friends. Let me introduce my panel. First, co-hosting with me is Flats. Flats, what's up?
Hello.
How you doing? You excited about this one?
Oh yeah, I'm actually, you were the one who put our questions together, and I can't believe you're having me lead off with this one. I can't wait.
Yeah. So we're gonna get interesting. We're gonna be discussing. Actually, you know what? First, let me continue to introduce. In the top left, we have with the lovely Juno background. Unfortunately, in this overlay, it's Juno's head has been cut off on my side. But we have lead hero designer Alec Dawson. Alec, how you doing?
Hey everybody, excited to be here today. I've watched basically every podcast since Overwatch 2 came out, so I'll be excited to be on here for the first time.
Thank you. Well, I apologize for anything you had to hear about.
All hours.
Yeah. Apologize for the time length and whatever you had to hear about us criticizing your work. But hey, appreciate you coming through anyways. And in the bottom left, as I said, the man himself here to discuss his blog and many other big picture questions, Aaron Keller, game director of Overwatch. Aaron, how you doing?
Doing pretty good. I'm a little bit nervous, like I've seen this. I haven't watched every one of these. Not like Alec, but I've seen a decent amount of them. And what's funny is the one that I think I remember the most was a year ago, and it was the great 6v6 debate. Like that was, I think that was a whole year ago, like this month, so it's like only fitting, right, that we come back here and kind of like continue it. Maybe next August we do it again.
Sure, I'd be very down to hear from you guys frequently, and we hopefully don't need to yell for 4 hours before we hear your thoughts. So, all right, I'm excited. So just to set expectations for all those listening and watching, we're going to be talking about a lot of things. We're going to start with some big picture questions, as Flats alluded to. We've got some, what I hope you guys will appreciate as potentially spicy questions. I hope the devs will see as informative questions. Then we're going to talk about format stuff, what the changes the devs are willing to make, tank stuff. Then we'll talk, obviously, 6v6. That's the issue that's been most, frequently discussed recently. And then we'll round it off with some final questions about like open queue and other little questions that Flats and I had. So, Flats, I'd like you to kick us off. As you already said, we've kind of got a rough running order, and I think this will be a good and productive one to start with. Go ahead, take over.
Sure. Man, we're gonna start hard and heavy here, I guess. But I think it's kind of the elephant in the room, and I've really wanted to talk about it for a long time. And Overwatch does not have the best reputation among the greater gaming community. Obviously there's the whole Steam thing and whatnot, and just post Overwatch 2 and all that kind of, or post PV Overwatch 2, all that stuff. So what would you do? What do you want to do to maybe move past that and maybe begin to repair the lost trust within the game and the community?
Here we go. This is like, I see how this is going to go now,
No fluff questions here. No fluff questions here.
Yeah, exactly. This is a great question. I guess I would start by agreeing with you. So there is I think that there is a reputation that we have, at least like I think maybe in the broader gaming space, and I don't want to push back on that. I don't think I want to. I don't need to go back too much into the history. Like I obviously have a history. Like I have a habit of doing that myself. If you've read the blog piece, right? But like I think that the community has some valid things that they can point at for Overwatch, and for Overwatch 2. And so I think that it is much easier to lose trust than to build trust, right? And we've had a saying that we used to talk about it. I think a little bit more on the Overwatch team is you're only as good as your last release, and so you could be just like, just knocking it out of the park, patch after patch after patch, and if you get a bad one, people don't give you a whole lot of credit for it, you know. And I'm obviously not our reputation just isn't just based off of, you know, good or bad patches, but like I think to move forward here, it requires us to have like a pretty solid vision for what the game ought to be going forward, you know. And I think we talked about it a little bit at BlizzCon, and I think we can talk about it a little bit more today, you know, like what the vision of the game is going forward. And it's us like really pursuing that, but then at the same time like having as much consistent and transparent communication with our community as we can. So I think that for us, it's a more of a long-term strategy of continue to make the game that that like that vision of the game for Overwatch better, you know, and to continually grow it and make it, you know, more of that game that all of our players want to play, and then getting in front of our players like we're doing today, like what like we've done in a lot of our blog pieces, and just talking about it.
Yeah, it's about following through, you know, say what we're doing, actually actioning on that. I think Aaron talked about it a little bit, but being more clear about the game we're making, and then seeing that being realized within the game itself with the release of features and, you know, how we go about balance as well. And then finally surprising our players with things that they don't even expect. I think that's really important for us to take big swings later on in Overwatch to show you like where the vision's going in the next few years too. I think a lot of it is currently we look at the game and we understand that players think there's really great content coming out. I mean, I'm so excited for Juno, obviously at the background, but it can't just be the cadence of hero release, and maps and continue that for a number of years. It has to be some other stuff too.
What do you think? Like, either one of you.
Hello guys, SEB here, and the Group Up podcast is back, and I'd like to take just 30 seconds of your time to talk to you about two quick things. Firstly, Patreon. If you enjoy the content, then please do consider supporting directly, because Patreon takes only about 10% of the money you give, where YouTube and Twitch take 40 and 50% respectively. So if you'd like to support the podcast, then that is the best way to do so. Secondly, if you're someone who enjoys video essays or detailed analysis of movies, TV, or anime, then please do check out my second channel, The Soak, where I'll be making videos about those kind of topics much more frequently, and where a lot of my attention will go beyond just Overwatch. It would mean the absolute world to me if you guys would check it out, but that's it for now. Let's head back to the discussion.
Like, what would you do?
Flash, you go first.
Okay. I think Alex is 100% right. It can't be just hero every 4 or 5 months and maps every other season. Especially with like how competitive the gaming space is. Everyone's fighting for someone's attention. And even, you know, even if like personally you might feel like if you felt Overwatch was in a good place, overall, like eventually people get bored of just the same thing over and over and over. And something new to spark their attention really does bring like life back to it. I look to like Fortnite when they did like their revamp of like going back on like, you know, the original release, and yeah, they prey on nostalgia with that and that kind of stuff, but like that was a big moment for them. It did bring a lot of players back. It did bring a lot of excitement back. And I'm not saying like Overwatch needs to do that, although I'm sure there's tons of people that would want that. They would just something big enough to like move the needle, because even though like Overwatch has changed a lot in the past 2 years, in some ways like very much for the better, even though people, you know, may not know that, or they don't know the communications, or they don't know about the balance, or they don't know like how often this kind of stuff happens. They don't even want to come back and give it a chance, right?
Yeah.
But like if something big enough comes, then they might try it and they like, oh, like this actually could be good. And that could be something that's in the game, so, you know, some kind of major change, or, you know, like we're going to talk about it here, 6v6. Like 6v6 is a giant format change. Like something like that is big enough to like, oh, like that could get people's attention. Or even something out of the game where you're like, you know, people always talk about having a TV show, or like whatever happened to like the cinematics, you know, because like early Overwatch, there were so many cinematics and they would just hit. And it just doesn't really feel like there's as much of that anymore. Honestly, if I had to choose, I would do both together at the same time. And, you know, fighting for people's attention in a live free-to-play game is really, really difficult. I'm very lucky to not have to do that job. But yeah, I think it's honestly a combination of a few things, but I mostly agree with Alec. That's just gotta be something big.
You kind of have to do that job. It's just like in a different way.
It's true.
Give too much credit.
I'll be very quick and succinct because I want to get to more of you guys' answers. I think I agree with the things you guys said. I think so. Just to summarize as well, what you guys said: more open communication, like paint a clear vision and then deliver on it, and then also bring some surprises. So I think all those things are really good. I think ultimately, whatever players you bring in and out, they have to be satisfied with the game they're playing. So I think the game has to satisfy the players, and then I would think, big picture, we need to make people fall in love with the Overwatch heroes again, because I think it's a big open statement, but what drew people early was the like, oh my god, I love the Dragon Short, I love Genji, I love Hanzo, I love seeing what they're doing, I love Mercy. Obviously, it's very easy for me to sit here and say, yeah, I want that TV show, as Flat's already mentioned, I want that Netflix show. I think I've told you guys this directly as well, that I think it's a big thing, but anything I think that you guys can do to make players fall in love with the heroes again. We know PvE is kind of not happening in the way it was going to happen. But I think we need to fall in love with Overwatch again, I think, is the TLDR. Anything you guys want to add before we move to our next question? Alec and Aaron.
Yeah, I think we could probably start talking about just like the vision for Overwatch.
Actually, that was my next question, actually. Yes,
yeah.
That's perfect. Because I'll just set up the question, which is that, we're about 8 years in now, right? This is about to be the 8th year of Overwatch. And I think I look to the other games that have been out for this long, like League of Legends, like Dota, Counter-Strike. It feels like they have a pretty clear definition of like, this is what the game is. Like, this is what you sign up for when you play. I personally, I find that changes a lot with Overwatch. It has changed a lot, as you kind of alluded to in your blog, Aaron. Like, the format changed so much. We went from like 6 Winstons to now we're 5v5 and 1 tank, 2-2. What to you guys is the core identity of Overwatch? Like, what does it boil down to when you strip everything else away? What will it always be achieved or aim to be? And yeah, I imagine you'll say that it's changed a lot, but if so, where do you think it lands now?
Yeah, this is a big one, right? This is like, we could talk about this one for a long time. Like, in short, I think, Overwatch, like what we want it to be is just the best team-based, competitive, hero-based arena shooter that we can make it, right? PvP arena shooter that we can make it. And I think that there's a competitive nature to our game that's integral to the enjoyment of it. And you're right, it has changed over time. Like, it was the game when it first launched, like it had no hero limits, right? For months. I think it was November of 2016 before that was finally included in quick play, right? So it's like there was a part of like the original like essence or the original soul of what Overwatch was that was a little bit crazier, a lot crazier than what it is right now, and we have a design value at Blizzard, which is like the right decisions change over time, and you can kind of look back at the history of Overwatch, I think, and see where like I don't really know if it would have been the right thing to do to ship Overwatch with role queue, let's say, but like you can see why it became the right decision for the game. And so I think that we're in a place right now where the game, the player base that we have, it's a fairly competitive player base. They're pretty invested in the game. And I think that the direction that we go in the future is to serve like this set of players and to continually improve upon the game experience that we have right now. You talked about some of the other games that have come out, in the meantime, right? And there's games that have come out, and then there's competitive games that have been out for a long time. I think that have some things maybe that Overwatch is missing a bit. And one of those things is either like we talk about this internally a lot, either like a greater strategic depth or player agency. And when you look at it, there is a lot of strategic depth to Overwatch, but a lot of that is like putting together your team composition. Once you get into the match, it really is like executing, right? And there's not, besides like swapping to another hero, there's not like a ton of other choices to make. And like you have a lot of other games where there might be other choices to make inside of that. That was part of what the pickable passives, quick play hacks was trying to get at. Are there other systems that we could potentially put into this game that give players more agency, or that start giving the game a little bit more strategic depth to it. Overwatch also, it is incredibly fast paced. There's a lot going on, so it's like I think we can only do a certain amount of that at any one time before people start getting overloaded. But we're starting to look at that, and so it kind of gets into, like, as we talk about the future for Overwatch, we think that that we always ought to be working on at least like one big bet for this game. And there are some, I think, some really exciting things that are happening right now internally, so it's like, I guess, like, I agree with you of like, what is that magic, how do you introduce people to this magic of Overwatch? I think we have some ideas on some things that we could release to do that. And so for us, like, I know this is kind of going long, sorry, but you start looking at like, what are the things we can do to the core game to start either improving it from a competitive standpoint, or doing things like adding strategic depth or player agency to it in or out of the game. That could also be something like a map voting system. And then what are the really big bets that we can make on Overwatch as well, to like kind of like really kind of like expose Overwatch outside of like our community, this like very invested hardcore community. There's a much bigger gaming community outside of that, and there's a lot of opportunities to, I think, reintroduce Overwatch, the PvP shooter, to that community.
Yeah, I think if even when you look at conversations on the team within probably the last 6 months, where the focus has shifted, it's been much more. You can kind of like almost see these words on the wall, like we're a social competitive game, and that starts to lead some of the things we're talking about in more seriousness than maybe we did previously. I think there's a lot more serious conversations around bans, more serious conversations around tournaments, more serious conversations around map voting. I think a lot of that might have been a little like, oh, that would be nice in the past, but I think now those are things that are top of mind that we want to actually try to build towards eventually, and I think even looking at the social part of that, I think one of our goals right now as a game is to restore the social fabric within the game. I think that's been something that we recognize has been lost over time. And games come out at different times. I think even the way people communicate has changed, right? Just look at how many people are in Discord now compared to when Overwatch first launched, and how people communicate through that versus like in-game chat, right? But there are things we need to do to make it feel more like a social experience than it previously did as well. So I think those are some of the things that just come into focus a lot more, and where you'll see some of the resources go.
Yeah, and I think, like, it might be interesting to talk a bit, and what, like, interrupt at any time if you want to like move on.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, finish your thought,
Oh,
Aaron,
you're
and then
good. I'm loving
we'll
this.
yeah,
Okay.
we'll move on once we're ready.
It's probably good to even define what competitive means, because like that is a term that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? And I think even in gaming, there's probably a spectrum of competitive games out there, and it's like you put like a game, let's say like Counter-Strike or something like that, that's kind of like pegged pretty far to the end of that spectrum in how competitive it is. And like there's multiplayer games out there where I guess you compete against each other, but they're really just about the fun rather than the competition. Like you're going to go play Mario Party or something like that. Like it's kind of hard to call that a competitive game even though you're competing. And so there is like this spectrum that you kind of that I think it's important to kind of like know where you exist on that, and kind of like how do you place yourself. And I think we are I don't think Overwatch itself is the game that we are trying to peg all the way on one side of that. Like, and if you're saying like, let's say the right side of that graph is the most competitive you can get, and the left side's the least, we are closer to the right. I don't think we're in the middle or anything like that. So it's like we treat our game as a competitive experience. And we want people to have that sort of like that spirit and like that seriousness a lot of times when they play it. But it's not all the way over on the right side.
Blast, do you mind if this is the second? We're gonna start going ad hoc now. I think we have to like scrap some of our plan, because there's some interesting things
I
there
was thinking the same thing.
that I wanna dig into. If like, do you mind if I ask a quick follow up on that, and then you wanna ask any follow ups?
You're good. You're good.
So like cause I like that you kind of define this idea of like we're a competitive social shooter. When you say competitive, what do you mean? Like, is it like people playing just comp? Is it pro play? Like, is it people only in top 500? Is it diamond? Like, where is comp, and whose experience is the competitive experience talking about?
So good, because there's the experience of playing a game, just like the actual release of the game, and then there can be, for a lot of games, a different ecosystem around that game, like a competitive ecosystem around that game. And so I think a lot of times what we're talking about is just the actual game of Overwatch, and not necessarily a lot of the other competition that's happening with it. And there is a range inside Overwatch as well. Like when you look at how serious people are in ranked, and how serious they're going to be in quick play, it's different. It's going to be different for every person, that's playing. Like there's a lot of people that treat quick play as their main competitive format of Overwatch, and it is actually our most popular game mode. Like more people play quick play than play comp. But not everybody treats it that same way, and so like we have to recognize that we're not going to be able to there's not going to be a one size fits all approach for this. And so I think that there is something really interesting about kind of having this range of competitiveness that we offer people in the game. But also we have to be cognizant that like people kind of play it for different reasons. So for us, like ranked, and like as you start getting into high levels of ranked, we treat that as an experience that we really need to protect the competitive integrity of it, and we put a lot of our efforts around balance, even and hero design, into like making sure that that side of the game stays as competitive as we can make it. But then as we start looking at some other parts of it, yeah, we want people to be able to have serious games of Overwatch. It's just not going to be quite as serious as it is when you get into comp.
Sure. Alec, anything you want to add before I let
That was
Flats
good.
follow up? Okay, awesome.
ahead.
Flats, go ahead. Anything you want to add to what was discussed?
Not really a ton. Just I personally think that quick play should be like way less of a comp system. I know most people play it, I know whatnot, but at least to me, as a mostly former competitive player at this point, I don't even play it that much anymore. I've always viewed as quick play as like the more fun, have a
Yeah.
good time with friends, like play with like off rolls type of game mode. But it does feel like as Overwatch 2 has gone on, it's almost like ranked light.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that totally is the vibe that should be going for it, because sometimes you just want to load up and like play your off roll or play something else, and it's like sometimes you feel like you kind of have to just lock in, right? Because like the game is so much harder. And maybe it's just me not misremembering, like Overwatch 1 leading into Overwatch 2 didn't totally feel as, I don't know, sweaty, I guess is a good word of maybe saying it. So that's at least how I feel about it, because I think the competitive side should always be competitive, and like you said before, have that competitive integrity to it, and really, be protected. Though I do think there are some things that could be done with it. Like for example, top 500 doesn't really feel that competitive. I barely play ranked anymore, and I can, as long as I finish my 50 wins, I can easily hold it, and I don't even think I deserve it at the moment. Like
Right.
it's really not that difficult. And so there's probably some things maybe even on that side that could be looked at, but I think that's for another time.
We used to talk about like a third queue, like, hey, is there like ranked, quick play, and like the thing under quick play, or the thing in between quick play and ranked? Yeah, so like there we used to have a lot of discussions around it, and maybe it's time to talk about those some more. Like some of the downsides to it is like the more queues we introduce, like the more it kind of splits up the player base. And then players also, they self-select into the one that they think that they ought to be playing. So in any one of those, you're still going to get, because there's people in comp that treat it just as like the clown car version of a game where they're just doing whatever they want to, right? And so like you would still have people in every one of those treating it just as serious as they do. And so like when we used to talk about it, we never really acted on it, because we thought it might just play out the same as what we've got right now, with people asking for a fourth queue after we introduce the third one.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I've thought about it that
again,
way.
Alec, anything you want to add before we move to our next question?
Honestly, it's something like we have difference of opinion on the team at times, which is like how much should comp and quick play differ. I mean, I think when we talk about like future systems, sometimes a lot of us are like these should be comp only. Like make sure these like more like crunchy systems are actually like only in comp. That's the experience you're opting in. So you can get like the lighter version of Overwatch and quick play. I personally think quick play has gotten too sweaty, and I think we should try to figure out ways to alleviate that over time. Whether it be like even in some of the experiments we're doing in the future with how we want to look at like roll queue and everything, or some other form of it. But it has gotten to the point where you play a game of quick play, maybe flats, and you go in and people are counter swapping you. You're like, oh, this is not the quick play experience you remember, or really maybe even you're looking for at that point in time, right?
I didn't intend to, but on that, I'm going to follow up, which is that, like, how have you found, because you've added a lot of systems which kind of make it sweatier, right? You've added, like, the lever penalties that are really harsh, and, like, the battle pass progress is, like, one argument I've heard since the start of Overwatch 2, people have said, well, I try so hard to quick play because I need to get certain things for my battle pass. So, like, that's another so, like, you've kind of added these systems, so, like, how are they performing on your end? And if you feel like they're successful, but you don't want quick play to be as sweaty as it is, like, how do you balance that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were too stringent at the beginning of it. We pulled back a little bit on some of those penalties in quick play, but definitely was too harsh when those first went out. I think that's something we're still evaluating. I think we were just talking to Gavin and Morgan yesterday about what some next steps could be for that, and if they're in the right place currently. There's also, I do think though, there's an element in quick play that you're still playing to win in some way. I think there's a level of like how hard you're trying to win, but I think if someone is literally AFK in spawn, or they're not even trying to be with the team, I don't think that's the right way. That's not how we want quick play to evolve either, right? We do want to be a place where people are still playing it's like you're playing pickup soccer with your friends. You're all trying to like have a good time, try to win. You may not like slide tackle each other like and try to like go all out, but you're still trying to have a good time, set up plays and score goals, right? I think that's the same sort of thing we want. We still want the game of Overwatch to unfold, right?
Yeah, it's
Awesome.
tough. I mean, there's 11 other players in one of those matches where somebody leaves, and so I think when people say, "Hey, this ought to be the more casual mode," they're right. But then at the same time, like, you are playing a social game, you're playing it with other people, and like one of the things that we look at a lot is or we talk about internally is stomps in the game, and there can be a lot of different reasons for stomps, but they don't feel good when they happen to you. One of the factors is levers in a game, and so it's like, do we want to, like, how much freedom do you give somebody to affect another player's experience in the game? I don't think there's like a perfect answer here. It's probably going to be something that, like, us and every other like social, especially like competitive game, is always going to struggle with, but we are trying to find like that right balance of like, how do you give players freedom, but also how do you like try to restrict them from like harming another player's game experience?
Yeah. And there has been differences there when looking at stomps. Like the spawn system that we have in quick play is different than the one in competitive, and we're actually looking at that for season 12 and maybe some improvements there to see like how we can make that even better experience, hopefully less stomps in the game as well.
Nice. Thank you. That's very illuminating, actually. Flats, you have anything you want to add?
Not on this part now.
Okay, cool. I want to actually skip forward a significant chunk, actually, if you're all right with it. I actually want to go into talking about tanks and stuff, because I think these guys have alluded to counterswapping. So do you mind if I
Yep. Yeah, no, go right ahead.
Right. So because Alec, you kind of mentioned really saliently there that, like, you're playing quick play and people are still like 5-man counterswapping you, and it's very frustrating. So I think that's partly where this 6v6 movement has come from, right? Like, people have said, like, look, tank feels maybe worse than ever to play. And it kind of feels like, and certainly the argument on the 6v6 side is that counterswapping is built into the one tank format. Like, you have one tank, there will always be counterswapping, and that always will create misery. So is that how you guys view it? Like, do you think that counterswapping will always be a thing in Overwatch 2? Or do you find like there's maybe some way we can alleviate it? And do you agree with the assessment that, like, people are like, this sucks. Like, this, as a format, this sucks. People swapping me all the time.
Yeah, I think there's a few things here, right? First off, what we see, like actually how players behave, is so DPS damage players and tank players swap about the same rate, right? They usually swap. You see on average like one a match, and then support players are about half of that, so they swap a lot less. And I think the experience of tank, you're kind of the one being targeted in this, right? It's not just that the tank swapping for you; it's also that the DPS swaps for you too. And I think everyone's talked about what are in some ranks where it might feel like Reaper, they get a Reaper swap into them. They're like, oh man, I have to deal with Reaper. That part can definitely be frustrating. I think there's ways we want to look at alleviating that. I think we want to look at some of those like more hard counters still. Make those a little bit softer. That's something that's on our mind. But also I think it's important for us to kind of have a conversation about that is a core part of the game. It's a core mechanic of Overwatch, and they're actually not necessarily like counter swapping to skill, but understanding team composition and how those go against each other. That's a game knowledge check to some degree as you move up, right? And we believe like that flexibility is really important in the game. We would never want to lock people into hero roles, into a hero choice for the whole game. I just don't think that's what Overwatch is, or what Overwatch is necessarily about. But we've tried some things internally. We looked at like limited swaps. We looked at maybe you have to earn your swaps. We've definitely gone through some experiments. I think we're still chatting about that right now. It's probably it's kind of crept its way up the list of things that are at top of mind for the team, and like maybe some solutions that we might need to look at. Because we understand that it is a frustrating experience, but also I think it's important to continue the conversation of what are the extreme examples. And for us, when we talk about the hard counters and versus soft counters, we need to kind of identify some of those that feel really bad, because it's map dependent, it's hero dependent, right? Just because they swap into Zarya and you're D.Va and you suddenly can't block the beam doesn't mean necessarily like a finished match. It's really dependent on like how much verticality is available to you. Do you have to change your play style? There's a lot of things you have tools at your disposal to deal with that, and we need to provide tanks with more of those tools in certain situations as well.
Fair enough.
I think
go ahead, Aaron.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go. We're here to talk. We're here to listen to you talk. So go ahead.
I think it's interesting too when you look at like the broad, or even like the broader Overwatch community, where like there's different parts of the community bring up counter swapping, tank play, and 6v6. I think more than other parts of the community. And what we see is some of this is actually even region specific, so it's like you might like it is something that we hear about a lot, especially like on like North American creators and stuff. But like some of like the other regions, they have kind of a different take on it, and we get feedback sometimes, like let's say we're talking like to our Korean players, where they might be like, can you please stop talking about this? Like, can you please stop talking about 6v6 and just get on with 5v5, because that's what we want to do. So it's like there is like I think what we want to, like, one of the things we would like players to know is that we totally get the feedback, and like what Alec is saying is we do actually think that there's some things we can do to address it in the world of 5v5. But we're also trying to listen to like all of our players like worldwide at the same time.
Yeah, and it's something because as I said, it's more top of mind. So we're taking a closer look at it recently, and what we see is swapping in matches actually happens the most like in plat and diamond compared to other ranks. Whether that be higher ranks are consolidating on the meta faster, or whether they're more one tricks in that area, and then bronze players just don't do it as much too. It's kind of like has this little parabola there.
Right. There's lots of really interesting things. Flats, anything you wanna?
I do kind of want to lead into one of my questions then, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Because I feel like it's kind of relevant then. I know we're probably going to talk about a lot of 6v6 stuff in a little bit, but let's say we run the test for the 6v6 stuff. Doesn't do well, right? We decide not to go back to 6v6. I want to know, how does the team feel about the game current day, like right now where it is? Because personally, I feel like Overwatch is a great casual game. Like if you just play a couple hours, either a week or, a couple hours a month, you probably think it's all right. But if once you start playing for a number of hours, you really start to see the flaws, and one of the big ones is with counterswapping. I personally agree and also disagree with the statement of like it is a skill, because that is true. But the amount of value you get for just swapping a singular person, like the tank player, because they have so much value compact into them. And I feel like that's a lot of the argument around the 66 is like, once you put it on two people, it's a lot harder to, focus on one person, because that attention is spread out, that responsibility is spread out, because you get so much value from it.
Totally.
But I just kind of want to know, like, what does the team think? And like, if this also kind of almost comes back to the first question of the interview, is we don't decide to do it, how do you bring excitement back to the game? Because 6v6 is potentially a nice thing sitting on the table. If we decide to go forward with 5v5 we are today, how do you feel?
Aaron, you want to start?
Yeah, I could go ahead. I can start on that. And I think you're right that regardless of whether we would move forward or like permanently swap to a 6v6 format, just running it would be something that would be pretty exciting for the community. Like we totally we totally get that. But like I think it's also like there's like a few things maybe to talk about in the question, because I might not agree with like all of the setup there. Like there's like probably a pretty broad set of like definitions of what a casual game is. And so like I mentioned like Mario Party very early on. Like that's a pretty casual game. It's hard to put Overwatch in the same category as a game like that. So I'd probably push back on that a little bit. Like the kind of like the mastery curve of maybe like any one hero in our game is pretty long, and like the mastery curve of like getting to where you feel like you could be good at Overwatch is pretty huge also. It takes a pretty big time investment to get into this game, and it's actually something that we talk about sometimes as being a problem and like a big obstacle for new players getting into our game, because there's just so much you have to learn and be able to sort of like execute on. And then like I think the other thing to remember is like we've got like millions of players every day logging in to Overwatch, and like when we look at our own like internal metrics on it, like the game, it feels like it's pretty sticky for a lot of these players. There's like a lot of people that feel like they're enjoying this game and continuing, and like in like their like in their interaction of it. And so like I think that like from our point of view, it's like, yeah, I think like we acknowledge the feedback and that there's things to be doing with tanks. And I don't think it's just counter swapping. Like the thing we haven't talked about yet also is like the pressure put on that tank player as well, so like I think that there's things to do there. Especially in the world of 5v5, like in the world where there's five players on each team, I think we've got levers that we can pull. And we also did talk about like potentially there could be other game formats that work in 5v5 as well, like maybe different ways of putting a team composition together that are a little bit more of like a hybrid version of a role queue system, so and maybe like I don't know if I had to get into this, like maybe I'm going a little too far here, but like I know a lot of people talk about that, like the mythical October balance patch, right? Where it's like, hey, here's where like 6v6 was in the very best state that it was, to where it's like if you never had that for Overwatch 1, would people still kind of be in this same headspace? Is there a version of balance in Overwatch 2 that achieves those same goals?
Yeah, I would second a lot of that. I think there's still like a really strong foundation. I think our content is getting better and better, actually. I think even if we look at like Juno's coming to season 12, I think our hero releases have gotten more defined in terms of what Overwatch 2 heroes are compared to what it may have been in the past. So very excited about that. I think there's Lifeweaver changes I'm excited about coming to the next patch. Things of that nature that we're looking at kits and being able to actually make them better. So I think there's constant improvement happening. Map reworks coming in season 13, right? So that we've spoken about as well. So I think evaluating all of that, I think there's really still a very strong foundation, but we need to make a lot of elements in the game more rewarding. Make sure that there's times you come back to play Overwatch because there's something going on that's very special, and I think there's a few of those like coming up. But also making sure like there's offerings for every type of player. I think right now there's a very core experience, but we need to make sure we put a little effort into things maybe above, like even more competitive than that core experience or less competitive than that core experience, right? Because those two are very similar, comp and quick play to some degree. So I think there's still a very we're working with a really good base here. Overwatch is still, I think an amazing game, but there's work to do for sure. And I think as long as we continue to improve it, I think we can end up in a good place.
Can I ask you a question just on like what you said?
Yeah.
You said like the content is like like is improved. I'm curious on like what aspect you mean. Just because we had a podcast recently. We talked about it, and like even at the beginning of this, we talked a little bit about like there's got to be something more to that cadence. What things would you say like are you guys most proud of those additions, or like what do you think are the ones that move the needle the most?
Well, I think there's been a lot of learnings. Even if you look at some of like a clear example to me is this is smaller in terms of the needle, right? But let me just go for it. Like if you look at Runasapi coming out, where it's like that takes a lot of learnings from Push and the first few maps of Push, and then I think it's the best design map for Push, right? And that's because we've learned things from when we released the mode. And I think you look at Heroes, you look at Juno, and we look at sort of some of the polish that's gone into there. There's a lot of people on the team, including myself, haven't been around for a very long time, right? And I think all of these people have gotten better and better over time. So we're making better stuff and we're making it faster. So that part of it was like seeing how the team works together on the day to day and being more focused and getting better at our jobs. I think that's helped a lot with some of the content we've released.
I think that there's a bit more there too. So like the say what you want to say about the competitive system that launched with Overwatch 2. But I think that like season 9 was like a really big step forward for the ranked system in the game. I also think that like when you start looking at a lot of the events that we used to run compared to some of the ones that we're getting into now. So something like Mirror Watch, something like the latest quick play hacks with pickable passives, even things like the April Fool's events that we run. We feel like there's really something about kind of like changing the way that our heroes play on a core fundamental level that our players like that really resonates with the player base. And so I think that like when we start talking about like content coming forward, whether it's for events or things for the core game, I think that we start looking at the response that we've gotten from players to events like that. Like Alex said, I think that there's like a lot of learnings that we've had, and it's taken us a little while to get to this point where we're like, oh hey, here's what it feels like our players like really want to play these types of events, get the most people playing in them, playing the most hours for the longest period of time. And so we think that like, and you'll see it in upcoming events that we're going to be doing, in upcoming seasons through the rest of this year and next year. I think you're going to see a lot more of that.
Yeah, I think like April Fools is one of these moments. April Fools, the 2023, right? Last year's one, where like we were like, oh, this is really resonating, and that was sort of where we started to sort of shift a little bit about, and now we're at this place of like, okay, these are the types of events we want to build, and it just makes everything more focused, and we feel like it hits better with the community as well.
Yeah,
in terms of these PvP things. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, it's not just events. It's like, how do we start pulling this stuff into the game?
Yeah, kind of everywhere, but that's like a isolated example of something.
Yeah.
Right?
Nice. Flats, here's what I'm thinking we do, because we've got about 15 minutes of their time left. I have one follow-up question on
Wait,
this
is that it?
No, I think we have longer.
We're supposed to have an hour, right? Or
hour
do
and
you
a
guys
half.
have more? Hour and a half? Oh,
Yeah.
we have more? Okay, well, that's great. If you have more of your time, then we don't have to kind of rush through. But in that case, I have a follow-up on this department, Flats, and then we can maybe start moving over towards like 6v6 kind of stuff, because I know that the 6v6 people will be very unhappy with us if we have this time with you guys and we don't kind of interrogate a little bit. But while you are talking about like all this big picture stuff, I'm just kind of curious. You mentioned, Alec, you were like, okay, map vetoes are on the line, hero bans are on the line. Like how big, And even Aaron mentioned as well that you're looking at like just big changes, like something that might even change up the format, the open queue. How big are we talking? Like, how big is the window of where you could go? Like, what can we see? Are we going to see like items, you know, like a MOBA item system? Are we going to see like some sort of talent system? You know, that's what the pickable passes alludes to. Like, how big is the table when it comes to you guys talking about it? And how serious are those discussions of like, yeah, we could actually go down this route of adding items to Overwatch, for example?
Yeah, I mean, we have conversations about these things. We have been testing some of these things, but I think what leads the conversation is it has to improve the core experience of Overwatch, you know, long term. It can't just be a short term, like, oh, this is nice, and then you're like a month later, like, actually, this needs to be removed, you know, from the game entirely. And that's why sometimes you see some of those things sort of come through quick play hacks, because they're experiments that give us a little bit of a, we gather some feedback. We actually have in-game surveys now that go out to players too, and get feedback from them as well. So when you see something like pickable passives, we're not necessarily trying that exact system. We're, you know, experimenting with the UI of this. We're experimenting with being able to make a choice in the game and how players actually feel about that. Do they change strategy? But it's not necessarily on the individual ones. Like, we've talked about here specific ones and what that may be and how that would look and whether that is good for long-term health. And that's something we've tested recently. So there's a bunch of different things we're trying out, I would say. But at the end of the day, they have to make the core Overwatch experience better. And there's a lot of things about that experience that people love because of, you know, how approachable it is and how clean it is. So if we did something like items, it would have to make the game better for hundreds of hours, right?
I'm having a hard time like answering the question without getting into too many specifics, you know, because I don't really want to like give away everything that we're doing. But I think that like maybe from like the high level big picture perspective is it's like I think that's like a fair ask from the community, you know, and it's something that we agree with the way that you frame this question of like what are some of the bigger things that you can be doing to the game besides just adding additional content to it. So um we like it's too early to talk about some of those, you know. You'll start seeing some things coming later this year that'll probably, you know, like kind of like give people hints and point to different systems that can be coming. um but like big picture is like, yeah, like I think we're like mostly on the same page here, you know, with a like a valid maybe not critique but a valid direction for where to take Overwatch.
Do you have like a little crumb you want to drop us, Aaron? Like a little like, oh, I really, you know, like this concept. Like it really kind of piques my interest.
No, because I'll just
No.
end up what I'll do is I'll probably do the whole thing and I'll get in trouble. So
You heard
we
me first, and he probably thought I said too much. So
we don't want to get anyone in trouble here. Okay, okay. Flats, you have
my
any
very
follow-up?
first interview
Yeah.
on the Overwatch team, we brought some creators in, and the one thing we weren't going to talk to them about, this is way before the game shipped, was that we were going to have cosmetics in the game. And like, why is that a thing you're not supposed to talk about? But whatever. And I was answering a question, and I just like, I don't know why I got to that point, and I just started, I'm just like people could see me start to say skins, and I said it, and it took me like 10 seconds to say the word. And I'm like this runaway train of like, you're not supposed to say this, and I just did it anyway. So
couldn't help it.
yeah,
You get excited. I get it.
It must be hard. Like it must be so hard having so many, like a million things, and also keeping track of like what you've made public and what you've not made public. I sympathize.
it's like hard to even play the game sometimes. Like I remember before like Overwatch 2 shipped and you're like playing Reinhardt trying to stop your charge because all you're doing at work during the day is playing with Reinhardt that gets to cancel his charge. And it's just like sometimes you just like can't keep it in your head of like what's live, what's coming this season, what's coming the next season. And it's like it's pretty awkward.
I can imagine. Flash, you have any follow-ups on this section, or should we move on?
I feel like we should move on. I think you should do the first question on the 6v6. I think that's a good one, right?
Sure.
Up to you.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I'm down to. And then I know Flats has quite a few follow-ups on the 6v6, which I'm eager. I'm eager for you guys to answer Flats' questions. So I'll start us off on the 6v6 section, which is just that, do you guys basically, do you get where the frustration comes from? Like, do you get the pain points? Because I think a lot of it, especially, comes from tanking. But do you get why people are seeking the 6v6 solution? Why they feel like we'll never solve the tank solution? Why we need the 2 tank synergy? Why it balances the game out? Why it kind of gives this higher skill ceiling? Like, do you get where they come from?
Yeah, it's a different experience to some degree, right? I think Aaron mentioned it. The pressure of that experience, the responsibility of that experience, is way heightened in Overwatch 2 compared to Overwatch 1, and that's something that's a lot of tank players may not enjoy. I feel like, especially if you're playing off tank and then you come to Overwatch 2, that's a different experience kind of in itself too. You're playing your hero that used to be able to take a lot more flanks and routes, and now your team's yelling at you maybe in chat, right? And if you look at the way we've designed tanks, we've tried to give some of them a little bit ways to let their team feel their presence more too, right? I think when you take the recent wrecking ball change, adaptive shields, it's supposed to be like a little thing wrecking ball can use from time to time that his team can appreciate wrecking ball's presence, right? And he's able to actually maybe help them from time to time too. It's not necessarily the main way wrecking ball is playing, but it's something there. So I think having a tank on your team leading the charge, a lot of players are kind of looking for that. And if you're playing a different role than that, then it kind of creates a lot of friction. And you get targeted more too. So we understand that solo tank has a lot more responsibility, a lot more pressure, and we've played variants of 6v6 where that does feel less, right? If you have someone that can cover for you, they can also cover for some of your allies to peel more too, because I think right now at the moment there are a lot of times where if your team's not coordinated or you're not on comms and maybe there are players that you're not familiar with, it feels like they're asking you to do one thing, but someone's asking you to do something else, and you can't be in 2 places at once all the time, right? So, but previously you had someone that could cover for you. I think we get that fundamentally, yeah.
I do want to push really quick back
Yeah,
a little.
let's do it.
I think it's genuinely hit the point where it's unhealthy. Where
Which
the
part in
average
particular?
about how much responsibility is on that
Mhm.
role and how much pressure there is on that role, that not even not even just high level players, but the average player legitimately cannot handle how much pressure is put on it between, in your metal ranks, that everybody wants a shield or wants someone to stand there. They want peel. They want people to be aggressive. They want you to get kills. They want you to have more damage than the other tank. They want you to have more pressure than the other tank. They want you to be counterswapping. If you're not counterswapping their tank, you're throwing. If they counterswap you, you need to either counterswap them back or have your team counterswap them, but they might not want to. It has gotten to the point where it's like not even just balance wise, because like I think a lot of people, myself included, overreacted to the balance patch that came out and thought it was pushing the tank balance way too far, the power meter. But it feels decent, like it feels good. But it's like it's so far over to the side, and it's like I have a feeling we're gonna have to pull it back. That even pushing it that far out, it still feels like you're sometimes 1v5 or you're 1v9 because you're fighting your 4 teammates. I'm not even just saying 6v6 is like the answer, but like that pressure is so immense that I don't even know if it's sustainable.
Yeah, there's a lot of social friction, and that's something we talk about a lot. Are there ways we could just better educate the player base as a whole, where they have a role too in the way the team is composed, right? Like your support players can also switch and they can also do these things. They can also play in different positions. But you're correct, Flats. I do think they expect your teammates expect the tank to do kind of everything a lot of the time. Yeah.
Actually, quick follow up on that as well. That like on that note, as Flats mentioned, when the patch came out, I saw a lot of the community kind of react strongly to be like, oh my god, they've giga buff tanks, like this is going to be awful. I think another consequence of what's happened, I see this shift a lot more in Overwatch 2 than I did in Overwatch 1. It feels like each of the roles are at opposition with each other. Like it feels like when, at the start of Overwatch 2, we had like, oh, supports don't have enough, and we needed to fix supports. Then for a while, it was like, we need to get DPS more stuff, and then it was like, oh, they get the DPS passive. Now we're back to like, well, tanks need more stuff. Like, is it always going to be this way? Are we always going to have like the roles kind of at war with each other? Like someone is losing, it's like a zero-sum game. Like someone is losing for someone else to win. Like, does it always have to be this way? Or do you guys feel like you do have ideas for how to solve that constant friction between the roles?
I think it's a matter of how far apart that is at any given time, depending on if it's closer together. I think at the moment you look at it, tanks definitely, well, tanks have always had the most influence on a match throughout Overwatch 2's history. Whether that experience felt good or not is a subjective opinion, right? But they've always had the most influence on how a match results. But at the moment, they definitely have a lot of the power as well in that dynamic. So I think, are they pushed a little far? Maybe, yes. And that was, somewhat intentional, trying to find, where would it kind of shake the core of the game a little bit too far. But we wanted to make sure that tanks were more resilient. I think what we saw in season 9, everyone dies more post season 9, right, for the amount of damage they take. But tanks had the biggest drop in what we would call tankiness there compared to any other role. We'll say it was almost double some of the other roles in terms of like how much damage they were taking for how much they were dying. So we wanted to kind of even that out a little bit, make them more resilient, make them feel like they could actually make plays with, be able to step forward without, blowing up. So right now, I mean, we're still evaluating it, but I think it's just a matter of how far apart those roles are. I think one role might be a little bit better than another role at any given time, or that's where the conversation may go. But if they're too far apart, that's when I think when we should probably, take a look at bringing them back in a little bit.
Sure thing. Okay. Flats. I'm going to take it over to you on some 6-6 questions.
Sure. I'm going to combine 2 questions into one to hopefully save some time. In the blog, it seemed like there was some hardware constraints with Overwatch 2 being a bigger game and a heavier game overall. Could the game even switch to handle 6v6? And if it did switch, is there a rough estimate on how long it would even take to, like, how much work would it take to switch the game from 5v5 to 6v6 if the test decided that this was a better format for the game?
Yeah, that's there's maybe like a little bit of context for that, because I think the answer is going to be it depends. Maybe not on the amount of work, but maybe on the amount of time it could take to do something like that. So yeah, there are some performance issues on some older systems with it that we would need to take care of. It's interesting, like when you look at different games and game engines and what they're like sort of like built for, is that like you typically are going to build your engine based off of the game you're running. So like the Overwatch 2 engine is very optimized for a 5v5 game format, and we do allow people to play 6v6 in custom game, but it's not really optimized for that. We've put all of our optimizations into running like the main part of the game. It's kind of similar to where it's like, I don't know exactly what engine, like let's say like Street Fighter uses, but you probably can't just suddenly start running a battle royale, in the Street Fighter engine. It's just not built for that, right? So ours kind of has like some constraints there, and I think that like there'd be work that we would need to do, and the timeline would probably depend on kind of like the results from some of these tests that we were to run. So like let's say we were to run some 6v6 tests and the community wasn't really that excited for it, or it was a very split thing. We would probably continue to put work into it, but maybe not at the same pace as the version where it's like, hey, we put out a 6v6 test, like everybody's just flocking to that. Like you see like the popularity of it to where it's like, okay, we're going to have to start dropping other initiatives across the team in order to like actually give like, or actually turn the game into the thing that we think is the best version of it and what players are like unanimously asking for, right? So I think in that world there is sort of like an all hands on deck moment where you're like, oh man, we've really got to do this, like I think that right now we are like in an investigatory, is that a real word? We are in a period where we are investigating like kind of like the total sum of what that work would be. But so like there's a range, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, where it's something that would be probably several seasons to much longer, depending on, like reaction from the community based off of any of the tests we want to run.
Yeah, and we look at sort of the gameplay side of it. I think it's, there's definitely a lot of effort in balancing that mode compared to 5v5 and making that shift, but a lot of that is subtraction rather than addition. I think we look at some of the reworks that have happened over time. We look at sort of what tanks are able to do right now, and we're not adding a ton of new abilities. I think if anything, it's looking at what don't some of these heroes need, and we'd be taking a visual pass in terms of clutter, and can we kind of redistribute some of that as well? Because we know once you add 2 more players, it's going to get more and more crowded in the game too. So I don't think the effort there is this giant thing that would take us a very, very long time. We want to be able to make sure if it was the best choice, we'd be able to be relatively responsive there.
Yeah. Flash, you want to keep going?
Yeah, I mean, it does sound like, obviously it depends on community reaction, and I highly doubt that everyone will be united on one side. As much as everyone likes to think they will be, I'm sure there's a large
Right.
silent majority of, and I don't like it, but casual side. I think of casual gamers as the TikTok gamers. That's how I think of them. They don't really like watch YouTube. They don't watch streamers. They don't do anything. They just like get a random TikTok at the beginning of the season that tells them all the changes, and they go, "Oh, what's all the skins?" And that's it. And that's like their Overwatch interaction. But it sounds like it would be a pretty long time. But I guess at that point, like, if it's a couple seasons to sounding like potentially years or a year or more, if it was even like a hell yeah, like let's go in, would that even be counting heroes that potentially need reworks? Because I couldn't see like Malga working, like or even heroes that I think are great, like Junker Queen, like probably need some tuning or some changes, maybe even. Would that be included in that estimate, or is that a completely different, like, that's just so the game can run, never mind all the hero adjustments that would probably be needed on top of it?
Those are like different parts of the team, and things like that can all kind of like work concurrently if we want them to. Like anything that you do on a game team, it's not, you don't have infinite resources. You have like a certain size of the team. So the more hero design resources you potentially put into reworks could theoretically slow down other hero or other hero work that's happening. It's not, that's not going to be the big lift here though. Like it really is kind of like looking at some of the performance considerations. I think that that's going to be more substantial work than the other sides of it. And they're like, and Alec can talk to this better than I can, but there are a lot of things to look at, like one of the things that we talked about the other day is just like, hey, in the world of 6v6, suddenly does Winston lose his alternate fire? It's like, probably not. It's just like, it'd be really hard to take that away, and it's a lot of fun to use. But there are definitely a lot of things we would need to look at, mostly in the tank role, in that world.
In that world that we're kind of theoretically talking about right now is also accepting queue times, right? Rather than having a plan for how to actually go about trying to make those better too. I think some of the experiments we're going to run are targeted at maybe making those things better, making queue times better. But if we end up, theoretically, if it goes to roll queue 6v6, we kind of know that's a problem already. There needs to be something there that can, help alleviate that over time too.
Is there any early ideas on how to fight those queue times?
So I think that there's maybe like a few things we could talk about. One thing we hear a lot from the community is just like make tanks more fun, and maybe there's a bit of that we can do. I actually think that there's some of that we can do. Like if you look at how far do I roll this back? If you look at the graph, the queue time graph that we showed in the blog, it's a very simple bar graph. The original graph that we were going to show is more of like an over time sort of like line graph, kind of like showing the queue times for different roles over Overwatch history. But we kind of wanted to put out the most simple one we could, just so that like everybody could look at it and understand what we were talking about. But one of the things that you can see is that there was a pretty substantial change in support queue times after Overwatch 2 launched, and like the role was in a worse spot than, like supports were really getting picked on. I think that there was like a lot of complaints from the community, and we put a lot of effort into supports to where now they're no, like, for a little while they were the bottleneck, you know, like right after Overwatch 2 launched, and they're nowhere near that point right now. And so I think that we have a story of us being able to look at a whole role and making it more appealing and more popular to players. So I think we could do some of that for tanks. But I mean, I've listened to some of you talk about this, and I think we're probably all in agreement that I don't think you ever get to make like tank as popular as DPS in like a game, you know? So it's like we could shift it and mitigate it a bit, but that would need to be something that I think we would be looking at in that world. And then I think some of the other things that we would talk about doing is coming up with a less restrictive like way of queuing into the game, you know, like that'd probably be where some of our initial experiments would run. And I get that that is something that could happen in 5v5 also. Like this, it is a different topic to where, yes, that you could do something like that in 6v6, you could do something like that in 5v5, but we would look at something like that in 6v6 too. And then there is a question, and like I I wouldn't want this to be the answer, but like I think as like as a team we have to be open to like any sort of reality that makes the game better. Like there is a world where like people want a certain format that they're willing to put up with longer queue times to have it, and that's just the game that they want, you know? So it's like some people might actually want that and prefer it, you know? So like we are like kind of like open to a lot of different possibilities. I think the one thing we haven't talked about here too is just like in that world is whether we actually run two different formats of Overwatch next to each other simultaneously. I think that like it's easy to say like that we think that there's a lot of work there, there's a lot of pitfalls there, but if you have like players like seriously asking for things, and there's like you can see the game, let's say, growing at a faster rate, or a bunch of people jumping in and really responding to something, why wouldn't you want to shift the way you run your game in order for one, for like players to enjoy it more, and two, for you to be more successful, for the game to be more successful, you know? Like so I think that there's a lot of openings there, and maybe I didn't. Now that I'm thinking about my answer, I don't know if I totally answered your question there.
No, you're
So,
fine.
like, okay.
It's all
There's
good
I,
information.
there's a few things on the tank one in particular. We actually saw with the mid-season patch, players like we want to look at this long term though, but players are not queuing for tank more, and they're queuing for damage and tank more than they were previously. And we have seen queue time gains with that patch, and that's has sustained itself too. And it's not like it's not the percentage, you know, I think that we talk about being like the holy grail, but I think that's a recent example of something. Okay, the experience has been powered up a little bit or brought up a little bit, and here are the results of that too. So I think long term we may have to change some of our hero cadence strategy if we ever end up in a different format, right? In terms of there needs to be more options and more types of play experiences for tank players in particular, if that is the case long term.
SCB, I want to rip it. I don't want to take away
Go for
any
it.
of your time. I want to rip it. Aaron,
Go
you
for it,
kind of
go for
led
it.
me into it. I have to ask
Yeah,
you this
do it.
question. Have you ever considered 7v7? And if so, could it even be feasibly done?
So not that seriously. A lot of our like we did some really early play tests in Overwatch development of 7v7. Um And it's funny, like I did say earlier that, you know, like the right decisions could change over time. So like, hey, maybe that's something you revisit, right? But at the time, a lot of the feedback that we would get from those play tests is it just felt like you were being attacked from everywhere at the same time. You know, there's just like enough players in the match that it happened. And I think that like I think what can happen sometimes is when there's one too many things, like the difference between having one too many things to track and 10 too many things to track can almost feel the same to a lot of players, you know, like you're just overloaded, you know? It's funny, like even in a lot of our like level design when we're working on maps, some of the last things you do is like you might close like one window or one door, and you get that same shift in feedback from like, man, I just feel like I'm getting shot from everywhere to like, oh, I kind of understand what's happening in this map, you know? And so that's kind of what happened in the early 7v7 play tests. I have a feeling we would get more of that. You know, like I would think that we'd probably get some feedback like that if we were to do it again. I'm also not sure if it's like the the solution to the queue time issue. I think it would help it, you know, like and I'm assuming in that 7v7 you're talking about like a
2-3-2.
2-3-2, you
Yeah.
know. Um but man, you have way less tanks queuing than support, you know, right now. So you're still going to have like an imbalance in the ratios between roles. And so like I think like mathematically it'd probably help a little bit. But I don't think that it would be the thing that suddenly gets us back to like really fast queue times with two tanks in there. Maybe. You know, like maybe I like kind of like talk about this here also because like one of the things that 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 5v5 does is it really helped with queue times, right? And we didn't talk about that much, if at all, when we made the swap, right, to Overwatch 2, and we did this. And like it was a like internally we discussed queue times as a big problem, you know, like in Overwatch, you know, it was something we really wanted to fix. Like a lot of people aren't going to wait that long, right? It's just like it is a long time to not be playing the game. But one of the things that we were actually never really able to get at before Overwatch 2 was what the real demand was to play DPS. Because every time we did something to like shorten the queue, like whether it was like the priority pass system or any of the other things we do, you as queue times would go down, you just see other people going and play DPS. Like there was always like this like sort of like undiscovered set of demand, and so like we weren't sure when we did this whether like if queue time suddenly went down, if you would just get a ton more people queuing for DPS and for it to not actually affect queue times. Thankfully that like wasn't the case, you know? Shoot, and I don't even know how I got onto that tangent. So I'm just gonna like slowly trail off on that answer and we can move on.
Well, you were talking about 2-3-2. I think that's why you were saying, because you were saying, well, we're
Oh,
still
yeah,
gonna need
there
a lot
you
more
go.
tank
77,
players.
77, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, we're still gonna need more tank players. I mean,
Do
yeah,
you
this
want
is really-
7v7 flats? I know you've talked about it. I just didn't know how serious you were as you've been talking about it.
I mean, it's the big thing was like the two tanks, right? Like people want two tanks, they want to have
Yeah.
the synergy, they miss the synergy, or they just want it to so it's like you can't blame one role, right? They can't just be like, it's only one of you, you're the problem, right? So a lot of people want two tanks, especially tank players. I think personally, from the people I've seen who say they want 6v6 are typically tank players. That is the majority of people that I believe who want 6v6. That would give them what they want. Q times is a big bottleneck on the DPS role, and people want to play DPS in every game. It's always the most played. So, like,
Right.
by giving it an extra role, my idea was like, when we went from 6v6 to 5v5, a lot of people believed that the game would be too open, like it would be feel empty, wouldn't feel like as full as it did before, but it didn't. It actually felt okay. My thought process is if I felt that way before, because the game's also evolved, right? Like the game's changed a lot over the years, and if the game didn't feel empty for 5v5, would it feel too chaotic with 7v7? It gives them the synergy, it cuts down on the queue times, it lets everyone still be able to play their game at extra DPS, allows people to queue more, but also people enjoy the role. That's a good thing. People want to play those characters. I think that's a really great thing to have in a game. Could it even be feasible though, because of I'm just gonna say it because probably can't. The Switch probably can't handle it. So is it even feasibly possible? That's kind of what I wanted to know.
It'd be, I think, like we'd have to do work, you know, for 6v6, 7v7 would probably be harder, you know? Um I can't promise that it would be harder. Like I haven't like actually talked to our engineers about it. Sometimes things that you think ought to be easy are hard, and sometimes things that you think ought to be hard are kind of like easy. And so like there can be surprises. So I guess I don't have like a great answer for you there. It is interesting though when you talk about like, like, hey, maybe that would bring queue times down. I don't think it would bring them down as much, but like there are like a bunch of in between versions of what we're talking about where it's like, well, what if queue times were only like 20% worse, and what if some of the social problems were only 10 or 20% worse, and you kind of come up with this other format where it's like, oh, hey, we've kind of like solved a lot of the problems, and like kept a little bit of the old ones, but not as much as we used to have, like in the world of OpenQ, or the world, even worse, the world of like No Limits or something like that. There's maybe like some versions of the game in there that actually work for everybody, but it's like kind of hard to talk about what those would be, but like I'm open to it.
Yeah, I think I'd like to come in at this point actually, because I think that this is something you've kind of alluded to, like you've alluded to around it. I feel a few times in this call, Aaron, and it, like Flats, I was wondering if I'd have to pitch my idea to you, but I think that like you've kind of already shown like a propensity just the way you're talking. I feel like you guys have already explored a lot of this, which is just what I want to talk about is the hybrid open queue. You mentioned it in the blog where you're like, we're actually looking at a hybrid open queue system. I think for all the people who are 66 enjoyers, there's also a section of people who are open queue enjoyers, right? And maybe they don't get, they're not quite so loud because it arguably is an open queue already, but that's really difficult because it's not really a seriously balanced mode. It's not really given much attention. But there is a charm to the open queue. There, it helps with queue times. It is a better way potentially to like for some people to enjoy. What is your, where are you at basically? Because you kind of alluded to your experimenting with it. So what are the ideas you have, and where are you at in terms of exploring a hybrid or open QE system for Overwatch 2?
Yeah, I can touch on this one a little bit. I think one of the things we're looking at with our experiments, there are important elements to any format we implement long term, right? We need to be able to make games swiftly, make sure those games are quality. We need to make sure that long term we think they're healthy and can be balanced too. I think we're gonna try some max 2 variants for sure. I think there's an element there of even in the 5v5 format, are there hybrids? I think there's like the first question everyone has is like 5, 5, 6, 3, 6. I think like our job as designers is to be like, actually there's like C, D, E, F, G, like we can keep going, right? Bunch of different options we can at least look at and try to learn from. So I think I actually saw your video many months ago about that max 2. So I think we're gonna like experiment with some sort of format there, but I think there's some questions of, do we want to try another format where that solo player actually gets a bonus of some sort? If you are that, say you're the solo tank and you're playing 1-2-2 again, but it's actually open queue format and you're playing against 2 tanks, it's gonna be rather difficult. Do we need to give you something? Or you're the solo support on a 2-2-1 team and you have to do all that healing. Do you need something too? I think there's a question there, something we might experiment with too. So that in particular, leads to a lot of other problems. Fun, not necessarily fun ones, but fun ones to think about. Whereas like, how do we do the rating in that? Like, how many people are actually flex? Are certain people locked into the roles of the game? Like maybe 3 of them are. So you always have to have a tank, a support, and a DPS at least, right? You have that at a minimum, and then 2 flex people come in. And so I think there's some matchmaking concerns there, but there's some stuff we want to try there, and throw out to the player base where some of these experiments might be flawed, right? But we want to get them in front of players just to see how they react and be able to learn from them.
Yeah, and I think like something like that max 2, that's more of a 5v5 test, like because all that really is 2-2-2 and in 6v6, but like there are, even in the world of 5v5 tests like that, I think could be very interesting. Like we've talked about like what it was like, before role queue was implemented in the game, right? You'll get into a match with like 5 DPS or something like that. That was just the start of the match. Typically, by the time you got halfway through that match, like most of the time, not every time, you kind of had a comp. Like people are just swapping and they're trying to make answers, and so like, I don't think open queue it is like the right answer for the main part of the game, right? Yes, we do have a community there. It's actually our third, like permanently the third most popular game mode after ranked and quick play. Like it's I think it's like close to like 10% of like player hours are just in like open queue, right? There's still a decent amount of people playing that mode. That being said, I don't think that we want it to be the main mode, but that flexibility of being like, hey, can our DPS just swap the tank, even if it's just for a little bit? Like we just want to do a particular thing without going all the way into that world of like, well, let's just have 5 DPS or whatever. I think that there could be something there that would be fun. The 6v6 side of it becomes more complicated, and also like there's a lot of versions of this where people might feel like they're being forced to play a particular role. Like there's ways you can implement this. Like it's funny, the way that we play test internally is something we just call role limits. It all means is it's open queue. Everyone goes into one of our play tests, and once you get 2 people to select DPS is just locked out, right? And so like there's versions of this that we could implement that could be like that, but suddenly it still means like if you were to do this and put this into comp, your tank player might not actually be a tank player on your team as you get into that. It does get into some of what we were talking about earlier, which is like, yeah, but is that good enough? There's a drawback there where you're going to feel like you're at a disadvantage, but is it worth it in order to have a system where you don't have really long queue times, and you're still able to have a different format of the game? Maybe it's not, right? But I think it's probably worth talking about more. It's another reason why we said this blog piece was like an introduction to the community. It's like we'd like to start talking about some of this with you. So whether it's like a 2, or some of this with the community, it's like whether it's a 2 like hero limit per role, in 5v5, or whether there's some sort of other role limit that we end up doing for a 6v6 playtest. It'd be nice to start working through some of that. I think we have a few that we want to run, and we'll probably be doing it in season 13. But other than that, yeah, like let us know.
I mean, that sounds super interesting. Flats, I have a follow up on that one, but do you want to interject anything?
I took way too much time. You got the rest of this. All you.
Thank you. No, I don't even know if I'm allowed to ask this actually. But so if you want to
Oh,
decline, feel free to say no. But I love that to hear that you're experimenting. I think 10% actually sounds like a really surprisingly high number. You're telling me that 10% of player hours are in open queue. I'm like, wow, I would have never guessed that. And that's
It might be more like 9, and it always kind of goes up and down. But yeah,
sure.
it's
still
pretty
like,
high
for me. I'm like, wow, because that's a mode that nobody really pays attention to. But do you? It's great to hear that you're experimenting, but do you there's been a lot of Overwatch, I'll say clones, we might say generously competitors that have been kind of coming around recently. Do you look at them and kind of get lessons from them, like relearn some lessons? Because they're kind of, a lot of them, one that rhymes with Arvel Kivels, that is kind of going through a lot of the same decisions that earlier Watch went through. Does having them experiment for you in some way, does that kind of give you lessons?
It could. We're always looking at other games. You like how I just turned this into like a generic answer?
That's totally fine. I don't expect you to be always necessarily be able to answer this.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about a specific game, but yeah, well, we look at other games and we try to learn from other games, and like it'll be interesting to see how some of these other games, whether they change over time also, like I think there is like a pretty decent part of the gaming community, especially when you talk about the free to play community, that kind of jumps from game to game, and so the ones that don't, they kind of become like your core audience, and your core audience will start, like they're going to have opinions on the way the game ought to go, and they're going to play it a certain way, and it's like in a competitive game, they could start finding issues in the game, and like every dev team, worth their salt is going to have to examine the issues that come up in that game and see what they do to solve them. So it will be nice to be able to watch other game teams like work through issues and see what they do to solve them.
Awesome.
Did that answer it?
Yeah, I mean, look, it just came to my mind, so I apologize for kind of like just throwing it out there. I know it's not necessarily something you guys can talk on.
You did it in an okay way. It wasn't too bad.
I don't
Okay,
like
okay.
barring questions, like
Yeah.
like I don't obviously want to go into an interview where you just like dodge for an hour straight, like that. No
No.
one's gonna want to watch that, but like you shouldn't feel like you're walking on eggshells.
Well, yeah, I
And
don't
even,
want to put you in an awkward position either. So, because I appreciate you giving us your time and talking
You're such
openly
a
with the
nice
community.
guy. How are you such a nice guy?
I think even then it kind of like, competition's good. It's healthy, and it starts to crystallize what makes your game special too. It helps you hyper focus on those things. I think Overwatch is very special for a lot of reasons, and I think a lot of that is like the love and care we put into our heroes, and hopefully like that's clear to people too. But I think that competition's great. I think it just makes you focus even more and makes it clear to players and yourselves like what are the competitive advantages that you have over other games.
Dude, that was like a great answer. I that's my answer also to that question.
Okay, okay. So scratch that back. We'll edit this in post. When this goes on YouTube, we'll just take straight up Alec's answer. I think it's a really I think it's a really good way of putting it. I actually want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which is that talking about like, hey, we're listening to you guys. Like you kind of brought up the 6v6 thing, so we listen to you guys. I kind of have two joint questions. One is like, well, how does the community get ideas to you? Because if I can be frank, you guys won't be able to necessarily say this, but like the 6v6 conversation was very loud for very long. It was like a lot of noise for a long time, and then we get this blog. I'm pretty sure we don't necessarily want that every time. We don't want huge divisive discussions every time before something gets thought about or talked about or addressed. So well, how does the community get ideas to, like, when there's a section of the community who are like, we really believe in this, how does that happen? And B, how much are you willing to kind of let the community do their experimentations and maybe empower them to do their experimentations? Because, with 6v6, there's like a code that people are playing in the workshop.
Yep.
I'm sure the workshop community would love more powers to be able to kind of run more tests and play. So those are my kind of joint questions. Like, how do you see the community's role in all of this?
It's pretty huge. So there's a bit of a history to this conversation, and actually like looking at it now and looking at the response of to the blog piece, we'll see what it is to this discussion, right? I kind of wish maybe we had talked about it a little bit sooner. There is a funny story here, like I wrote a different blog piece last December. It wasn't as good as this one, and I'm like, hey, I think it's time for us to like talk to the community about 6v6 because it has been consistent, but there's been up and down to it, like sometimes it's the thing that the community talks about the most, sometimes the community is talking about other aspects of the game, and so like with this one, like it was basically we were gonna like throw this blog piece over the wall and then we were all gonna go on like vacation for the holidays, and so we didn't really feel that comfortable about it. And then at the same time, the like at least back then, because we hadn't looked into some of the considerations of what we would need to do to really get 6v6 running, it was a little bit harder for us to talk about, right? To where like imagine you run 6v6 tests and everybody loves it, and then you're like, cool, we're not doing anything with that, because we can't, right? And so like I think for us, we wanted to do enough work to where like before we actually talked to the community about it, we would know that it's like, hey, if we were actually going to like look into this seriously, we would need to know that we would be able to actually deliver on something for our players. So some of that delay was us kind of like doing a little bit more due diligence in order to avoid kind of like shooting ourselves in the foot here. And then I think that like and it would be cool to hear from you guys. I know we're running out of time here, but like to me, I think this particular topic is unique and it's different from a lot of the other ones that have come up. I hope that like the community thinks that we're more open and responsive in our communication to other like topics in the game than we have been to this one, So it's like we have a community team that is like kind of like really like not just like working with different parts of the community, but like really following along with those conversations. We have a lot of people on the team that also do, like Alec, like earlier is like, hey, he's like watched every one of the Group Up podcasts, So it's like we're on Twitter, we're on socials, we're like collecting information that people bring in, and we are talking about it and reacting to it in game. And I guess like I'd apologize if it feels like we're not actually doing that based off of the way that the conversation around 6v6 has gone.
Yeah, I think it was hard to talk about, as you said, because of some of the noise early on, trying to get a clear read on everything. I think what helped over time was some of the more level-headed conversations, like your format and some other formats where people would talk about their side of it when they were actually trying to and be reasonable, and I think over time, like I think actually like in the last 6 months, it's actually gotten better and better, that conversation in some sense, even if it did maybe get loud in some places. So I think people just coming together and trying to objectively talk about the pros and cons of both formats. I think that brought a lot of clarity to the conversation and what people were actually saying, what they actually wanted, rather than some of maybe the polarizing conversations that were happening early on.
That's great to hear. Flats, any thoughts you want to share on that?
I mean, Aaron knows. Like we had our first interview. That was one of the things I wanted to talk about, and they were, "Oh, we want to talk about it later." And I was like, I was not happy with it. I was like, okay, like I'll take your word for it, and here they are delivering on it. So I appreciate that a lot.
It's so tough. Like I felt pretty bad about that
I
one
know.
too, and like maybe there was a different way to handle some of that. It felt like otherwise I was just gonna kind of like dodge it probably during the interview, and that probably wouldn't have felt that great either.
I knew you guys were taking it serious though, because it was like you told me, it was like, we're gonna talk about it, just like not right now. And I was like, all right, hey, I want to just be honest with people. And when I led into it, I was like, I know everyone wants me to ask the 6v6 question. I'm not. I was asked not to, but they said they'll talk about it later. And here we are later, talking about it and moving forward with an experiment and seeing how it goes. So I think these little things are going to matter a lot in the long run with your core community, people that actually follow all the stuff. A little bit difficult on the greater gaming community, or people who you maybe used to play Overwatch. Those people maybe don't play anymore. Obviously, that's a little bit tougher. But like from to tie it all back to the beginning of this this podcast, I think those little things really do re-strengthen that trust. So thank you.
Yeah, totally. And I know we're going over, but then here's a question for you. Like that was a pretty lengthy blog piece with a lot of detail in it, and we've typically tried to keep them shorter than that. Do you guys have like a preference here?
Longer,
You know,
more.
what?
More, longer.
Okay.
Honestly, you mentioned earlier that you only put one graph in because like you
Yeah.
didn't want to like overload.
Yeah.
I would like more, because personally, I probably, at least my headcanon was, beginning Overwatch 2 tank queues were probably longer because it was more fun, as opposed to like season 9, post season 9, where like everyone's having a bad time. It was probably instant, right? So like I would love more info like that, and I think that us having that data to dig into is really important, because like I'm just going to spell it all out right now. There's a lot of people out there that think Overwatch is a dead game, and I think they think that when you say there's millions of people that play every day, they're probably looking at this and going, I call bullshit. There's no way, because they don't have the Steam charts, because the Steam charts is not what most people play on. And if you
Right.
look at the Steam charts, it's quite low in comparison to, say, Apex or something like that, right?
Right.
But we have Battle.net, you have console, there's a lot of other things that play into that. So you have numbers we don't have. All that type of information will always, I feel like, do better, or reflect better for you, as opposed to like holding it closer to the chest. So that's how I feel about it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's really. Oh, go ahead, Alec.
I was gonna say, I think that information just has helped everyone have better conversations about the topic too. I think a lot of it early on, why it can get maybe so much fervor around, is like people don't have the information, so they're just they just have ideas of what may be the information. But I think that was really an important step for us to kind of like, hey, we're laying it out for you. Here's what it is, and I think we'll just keep doing that. We'll make sure we dig into some of the topics even deeper. Maybe not as deep as this one, Aaron. I don't know if we need to. I don't know if there's anything that needs a 9-page essay on in the game, but maybe like 5, right? So maybe something.
That's pretty amazing. You know, like as far as like giving players more information, like one thing we do talk about internally sometimes is like how we could potentially give people like a little bit more access to some of our data, not all of it. You know, like it's not really like part of Blizzard to give out like player numbers and stuff like that. But like as far as like balance and stuff like that, I think that there's like for the type of game we are and the type of audience we have, something like that, I think would be really useful to that community. It is a decent amount of work though, and so it's like if we were to ever do something like that in order to like get something like that going, it's there's a lot of planning we'd have to put around it in order to make sure it's not taking away from some of our other initiatives, you know. And it is like I recognize it'd be incredibly useful to the two of you. You know, you would love to have it. As you start getting like into other parts of the community, it might not be the most useful thing for everybody to have access to, but like we do have a dedicated hardcore community now, and like what they're looking for is a little bit different than I think our community was looking for 2 months after like the first game launched.
I'll be very succinct because I'm being told that Aaron, you're late for a meeting apparently, but Jared is saying you're late for a meeting. So I'll be really succinct and say, as someone who runs a 4-hour blog regularly, more is better. I real talk, I don't know if casual players really read the blog, so it's like only us hardcore people who read the blog. So just pack it with information, give us more context, and that will inform our conversations better. As Alec alluded to, like when we have this data, we can talk reasonably and rationally. When we don't, we're just throwing darts at the board and guessing at what your reasons might be. So more data.
The
more
moment that the moment you're able to make your 8-hour podcasts, that's when we're like, that's the success case.
Exactly.
Hey, to be fair, there's a lot of people, myself included, who read those to people, and lots of people watch those be read. So like it goes much further, I think.
Yeah.
Huh.
I watched you read yours.
Yeah. I hope you liked it.
Yeah, that's
It's
what.
it's a little awkward watching somebody read what I wrote, you know.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
It's okay. Flash used to react content, so he reacts to other people's videos and then probably reacts to people watching his videos. So it's all part of the content game. Flats, is there anything else you want to say before we sign off? Because I think we do have to let these guys get going.
Just thanks for doing this. Much appreciated. Look forward to everything you have coming, and really hope that we have some exciting stuff to look forward to in the future. And I know that you guys will do whatever you can to make the game as good as it possibly can be.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. You're both great.
Thanks for having us. Seriously, I'm glad you could push back, and you felt like you could push back in the conversation. I felt it was nice back and forth, and really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I super concur with what Flat said, and I'll just add that I think that, like, obviously this is, take it with a pinch of salt, Shield biased SVB because he's got these guys on the call, but you guys are orders of magnitude more communicative than we ever had devs in, with the Overwatch one. I recognize devs as in you were in the team then too, Aaron, but nowadays you guys are way more communicative with us, and I think it really, really like helps us. Like, it makes me feel better. I'm sure Flats feels better when we know what you're doing, what you're thinking, where you're coming from. It makes it so much easier to understand you guys' perspective and to be more empathetic to like the problems you're trying to solve. Whereas, again, when it's a little bit in the dark, I think the community gets a little bit antsy. And so I really, really appreciate you giving us your time, so much of your time, and being so open and candid and doing your best. I know you did your absolute best to answer everything you could, and I think you did an amazing job of actually giving us really helpful information, not just, dodging every question and giving us PR crap. So thank you guys. I really appreciate it a lot.
All right. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you very much. Peace
Later.
out. See ya.